I have seen a lot of things in my courtroom. I spent years in Manhattan family court watching people make every excuse imaginable to avoid owning what they did. But every now and then, someone walks through that door who thinks fame, or the illusion of it, changes the rules. Let me tell you something, it doesn't. Not in my courtroom, not ever. If you believe accountability applies to everyone equally, hit that like button right now and stay with me, because this case is one I still think about. Her name was Cassandra Vell. That's what she called herself anyway. On social media, she went by Cassie Vell, about 2.3 million followers across platforms, a brand deal with a skincare company, and a lifestyle that from the outside looked like it was built on sunshine and sponsorship checks. She walked into my courtroom wearing sunglasses indoors. In February, I noticed that immediately. I also noticed she handed her phone to what I assumed was an assistant, a nervous young woman who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days, and whispered something before sitting down. I've been reading people for decades. That whisper was not about legal strategy, that was damage control. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want to see more cases from my courtroom, because this one is just getting started. On the other side of the room stood Marcus Webb, 43 years old, small business owner. He ran a boutique event venue in Brooklyn, the kind of place that does wedding showers, birthday parties, corporate dinners. Marcus had rented his space to Cassandra Vell for what she described as a brand activation event, essentially a party she was throwing so she could film content, invite her followers, and call it work. Marcus had a contract. He had a deposit. He had a cleaning and damage policy spelled out in plain English, initialed on every page. And he had $4,200 in property damage and unpaid fees that Cassandra Vell had flatly refused to pay. She didn't just refuse. She went on her social media and told 2.3 million people that Marcus Webb was trying to scam a small creator. She called him a predator. She said his venue was a trap. I read that post 3 times before she arrived. I have a word for that kind of behavior. Several words, actually. But I'll keep it professional. Let me ask you a question. Does any of that sound like someone who signed a contract and intended to honor it? Before I tell you what Cassandra said when she sat down in front of me, let me tell you about the paperwork Marcus Webb brought, because this is where the case started to tell its own story. Share this video right now if you know someone who thinks internet fame puts them above basic responsibility. Marcus came prepared. I respect preparation. He had the signed contract, the deposit receipt, the pre-event walkthrough photos, and the post-event damage photos. He had a timeline, he had texts, he had emails, he had a detailed invoice for repairs, including a broken vintage mirror valued at $1,800, part of the permanent venue decor, 3 damaged folding tables, a burned section of carpet from what appeared to be a candle left unattended, and 2 hours of unauthorized overtime charged to his staff. His total claim, $4,200, every dollar documented. Cassandra's response to the claim? She brought a printed screenshot of her follower count. I am not making that up. I leaned back in my chair. My bailiff, Officer Tompkins, didn't move a muscle, but I saw his jaw tighten. He's been in that courtroom with me for years. He knows what I'm thinking before I say it. Ms. Vell, I said, I see you brought some documentation. Yes, Your Honor, my platform reach. I'm going to stop you there. I held up one hand. This courtroom operates on evidence, receipts, photos, contracts. The number of people watching you eat avocado toast is not evidence. The young woman with the phone, the assistant, looked down at the floor. If you've ever had to deal with someone who thinks their status exempts them from responsibility, leave a comment below. I want to hear about it. Now here's where it gets interesting, because Cassandra Vell was not simply arrogant, she was strategic. And strategy, in my experience, usually means someone has something to hide. She began by disputing the value of the mirror. She claimed it wasn't vintage, it was mass-produced, and she'd seen the same one online for $200. She produced nothing to support that, just said it, confidently, like confidence was the same as fact. I asked her directly, "Did you or your guests break that mirror?" She said, "Things happen at events." I said, "That's not what I asked." She said, "I can't control every person in the space." I leaned forward. "Did you read Section 4B of your contract before you initialed it?" Silence, just long enough to be meaningful. Section 4B, I said, sliding the contract across so she could see her own signature, makes you responsible for all damage caused by you, your guests, your staff, and your vendors during the rental period. You initialed it. Right there. Is that your initials? She looked at it. Yes, but I'm speaking. That's the thing about contracts. People sign them when they think everything is going to go perfectly. They read them very carefully when something goes wrong. The two timelines never line up. That is the oldest story in civil law. But then I heard something I didn't expect. Cassandra Velle's attorney, a young man, clearly out of his depth, sitting just to her left, cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, we'd like to introduce evidence that the damage was pre-existing." I raised one eyebrow. "You have documentation of that?" "We have testimony." "From whom?" "From Ms. Vell's event coordinator." I looked at the evidence log. No affidavit, no photo, no written statement on file. "Where is this coordinator?" I asked. "She's available by phone." I looked at my clerk, Patricia. Patricia has been doing this longer than most attorneys have been alive. She looked back at me with an expression that said exactly what I was thinking. "This was prepared 5 minutes ago." "That's not how this works," I said. "You had a filing deadline. You missed it. You don't get to introduce surprise witnesses in my courtroom because you didn't prepare." I turned back to Cassandra. "Let's talk about the carpet. Hit that like button right now if you believe the truth matters more than followers." The carpet damage was harder to dispute because Marcus had a time-stamped photo taken during the walkthrough, 3 days before the event, showing the carpet in pristine condition. And he had a photo taken the morning after Cassandra's event showing a clearly burned section near the lounge area, consistent with a candle. In the background of one of Cassandra's own event photos, which her team had posted publicly, you could see candles placed directly on the carpet. "Ms. Vell," I said, "do you recognize this photo?" She looked at it. "That's from my event recap post." "And what do you see in the lower left corner?" She was quiet. "Are those candles?" "My decorator placed those." "Your decorator, who is also covered under Section 4B of your contract." I set the photo down. Now we're getting somewhere. This is the moment I live for in a courtroom. Not because someone is caught. That's not satisfying to me. What's satisfying is when the facts simply align themselves and tell the truth without any help. A good judge doesn't manufacture conclusions. A good judge follows the logic until it lands somewhere honest. But I want to be fair. I am always looking for the other side of the story, because in 30 years I have been surprised. Not often, but it happens. So I turned to Cassandra Vell and I said, "Is there anything you want to tell me about what happened that night that might change my understanding of this situation?" And she did something I didn't expect. She got very still. The performance dropped, just for a second, and she said quietly, "The mirror was already cracked. I saw it when we arrived." I waited. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to start the night on a bad note. I should have documented it. I know that now. I noted that. A small sliver of honesty in an otherwise evasive presentation. I filed it away. "Why didn't your attorney raise that in the filing?" I asked. "Because I didn't tell him until this morning." Subscribe now. This channel is where justice actually gets served, and this case is about to turn. So let me tell you where we stood at that point. Marcus Webb had clear documentation of 3 of the 4 damage items: the candle burn, the broken tables, and the overtime labor. The mirror, the most expensive item at $1,800, was now disputed with at least a partial claim of credibility. Cassandra had offered no documentation for the pre-existing crack, but she had admitted she noticed it. That matters. That is the kind of small, verifiable honesty that changes a ruling. I called a brief recess. In my private moments between cases, I think about what justice actually is. It is not punishment. It is not revenge. It is calibration. It is making something as right as it can be given imperfect information and imperfect people. That is the job, and it is never as simple as it looks from the outside. I came back and I asked Marcus directly, "Did you have any documentation of the mirror's condition before the event other than the walkthrough photos?" He hesitated. "I have the photos from the walkthrough." I looked at those photos carefully. The mirror was visible in the background of one shot. The angle wasn't ideal, but the surface, from what I could see, appeared intact. I asked Patricia to note that in the record. Now for the piece of this case that no one in that room was prepared for, and I mean no one. During recess, my clerk had been processing some standard pre-ruling paperwork, which included a routine financial disclosure check tied to the arbitration filing. What came back was unexpected. Cassandra Vell's primary business account, the one connected to her brand deals, showed a pattern of disputed charges. 3 other small vendors in the past 14 months had filed similar complaints. A florist, a photographer, a catering company. None had collected. All had settled for less than they were owed, or simply walked away because they couldn't afford the fight. This was not a woman who had one bad event night. This was a pattern. If you've been following small business owners getting taken advantage of by people who think their platform protects them, share this video. Share it right now. I called both parties back to the bench. I laid the disclosure record on the desk in front of me. I did not wave it around. I did not dramatize it. I simply said, Ms. Vell, I have here a record showing 3 prior complaints from small business vendors in the past 14 months. Similar circumstances to today. Would you like to speak to that? Her attorney touched her arm. She shook him off. Those were all resolved, she said. Resolved meaning they stopped pursuing you, I said. That's not the same as being right. I didn't do anything wrong in those situations either. I looked at her for a long moment. Baloney. That's what I was thinking. Pure, unvarnished baloney. Ms. Vell, let me ask you a question. Do you understand that in this arbitration proceeding, I have the authority to issue a binding financial ruling, and in cases where I find evidence of deliberate noncompliance with a contractual obligation to request an emergency account freeze as a protective measure pending enforcement? The room got very quiet. Her attorney sat up straight. Your Honor, I'm speaking. I let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Because in 30 years on the bench, I've learned that 3 seconds of silence does more work than 3 minutes of argument. I'm not here to embarrass you, I said to Cassandra. I'm here because Marcus Webb came to me with a signed contract, documented damage, and a business that he built himself, and you decided your platform gave you the right to ignore your obligations and then publicly slander him when he asked to be made whole. I paused. That doesn't make sense as a business practice. And in my experience, when something doesn't make sense, it's not happening by accident. Hit that like button if you believe small business owners deserve the same protection as anyone else. Here is my ruling. On the damage to the carpet and the candle burn, I found fully in favor of Marcus Webb. The photographic evidence was clear, the timeline was documented, and Cassandra's own content confirmed the candles were present. That portion, $620 for carpet repair. On the broken folding tables, fully in favor of Marcus Webb. No dispute from the defendant that was supported by any evidence. $380. On the overtime labor, fully in favor of Marcus Webb. The contract clearly defined rental hours, and the event ran long. Staff logs confirmed it. $400. On the mirror, this is where I made a judgment call. Cassandra had offered no documentation of a pre-existing crack, but she had told the truth, late and reluctantly, that she'd noticed something. Marcus's photo was not conclusive enough to rule 100% against her claim. So I split the mirror damage. I awarded Marcus $900 of the $1,800, representing partial liability, and I noted in the record that both parties bore some responsibility for the documentation failure. Total award to Marcus Webb, $2,300, but I wasn't done. Before I tell you the rest, subscribe to this channel, because the next part is what made this case something I still quote in conversations about accountability. I looked at Cassandra Vell and I said, Ms. Vell, given your history of non-payment to small vendors, and given that you are a public figure with the resources to make good on this debt today, I am issuing an immediate enforcement order. You will provide payment to Mr. Webb before you leave this building. If you cannot produce payment today, I will authorize a temporary freeze on your primary business account until the funds are transferred. Her attorney was on his feet. Your Honor, that's within my authority under the arbitration agreement she signed, I said. Read Section 12. He sat back down. Cassandra Vell looked at me like I had grown a second head. She was used to people backing down. She was used to being the one with the power in the room, and she was genuinely unaccustomed to a room where that currency didn't spend. This is going on my platform, she said. I almost smiled. Ms. Vell, I have been on television for decades. Whatever you put on your platform, I have seen worse. And the camera tends to be fair. It shows people exactly as they are. She paid. Right there, in that room, her assistant produced a business card linked to a payment account. The clerk processed the transfer, And Marcus Webb walked out of my courtroom with $2,300 in his account before noon. I watched his face when the confirmation came through. He didn't pump his fist. He didn't gloat. He just nodded quietly, like a man who had been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. That is the face of a person who built something real and fought to protect it. I have a lot of respect for that face. Share this video for every small business owner who has been told their contract doesn't matter because the other person has more followers. Now let me tell you what happened afterward, because this story has a second chapter and it matters. About 6 weeks later, I received a letter, not from Cassandra Vell, from her assistant, the young woman who had been sitting in the back with the phone. She wrote to tell me that she had quietly left the role 2 days after the case. She said watching that proceeding was the first time she had seen her employer face a consequence that actually stuck. She said it clarified something she had been trying to ignore for a long time, that working for someone who treated obligations as optional was not a career path, it was a trap. She had started a small marketing consulting business. She was building her own client list. She thanked me for what she called a public lesson in what contracts actually mean. I kept that letter. I don't keep many things, but that one reminded me why this work matters, not just for the person who wins in the courtroom, but for every person watching who is trying to decide whether rules and responsibility are still worth something. They are. They always are. Let me tell you something about entitlement. True entitlement is not about money. It is not even about fame. It is about a fundamental belief that the rules that govern everyone else simply do not apply to you. I have seen it in every tax bracket and every zip code. I have seen it in people who drive luxury cars and people who drove nothing at all. Entitlement is a posture. It is the posture of someone who has never been made to stand still long enough to face what they've done. My job, the job I chose, the job I love, the job that has cost me nothing I regret, is to make people stand still, just for a moment, just long enough for the truth to catch up. Cassandra Vell was not the first person to walk into my courtroom thinking that what she'd built outside it would protect her inside it. She will not be the last. But I hope, and I mean this genuinely, that something about that morning stayed with her. Not the payment, not the account freeze order, but the moment when her own content, her own photo, her own public record told the truth she was trying to bury. If it doesn't make sense, it's not true. That is not just a courtroom principle, that is a life principle. The version of events that requires everyone else to be dishonest and only you to be the victim, that version almost never holds up, because the truth is geometric. All its lines connect. And when they don't connect, you start pulling at the thread and eventually the whole thing unravels. Marcus Webb sent a follow-up note 3 months later. The venue was doing well. He had added a new clause to his event contracts, more detailed documentation requirements, pre-event sign-off on existing conditions. He called it the Cassandra Clause. I appreciated that. Tell me in the comments, what would you have ruled? Would you have split the mirror cost or awarded the full amount? I want to know what you think fair looks like. To every small business owner, every contractor, every person who signed a document in good faith and then watched someone try to walk away from it, your contract is your dignity. Do not let anyone tell you that your agreement is optional because they have more followers, more money, or more audacity. And to anyone watching this who recognize themselves in Cassandra Vell, not the fame, but the habit of treating obligations as suggestions, let me be direct with you. The account always comes due. Maybe not today, maybe not in a courtroom, but somewhere, with someone, it will come due. And the earlier you understand that, the more of your life you get to spend building something real instead of managing the damage from something you refuse to own. That is my ruling, on the case and on life. Subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who needs to hear that accountability is not optional. I will see you in the next case, because nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what walked through my courtroom door next.